Welcome back to the Going Deeper podcast. Thank you guys for joining me today. Today I have Tilly Dillehay. Is that how you say your last name, Dillehay?
It is. You got it.
Perfect. Tilly is a pastor's wife. She's a homeschooling mom of four. She's written for Desiring God, the Gospel Coalition, Risen Motherhood. She's also the author of 3 books. My Dear Hemlock, which we're going to talk about today, Seeing Green, and Broken Bread, which I will likely go and buy off of Kindle as soon as we're done. And she co-hosts the Home Fires podcast. Thanks for coming on, Tilly.
Thanks for having me. I'm
Yes,
excited.
I'm excited for this conversation as well. As I told you off camera, this was one of the best books that I've read in a really long time, and for so many reasons. But I want people to listen, like who are listening, to know I'm not just saying it to say it because you're on. I really, really enjoyed this read, and I even think I'm going to do a summer book club with some women from our church because I think that it will spark really good conversation. So just kudos on. I don't even know. How did you even come up with a book like this? We'll get into that, but so good. So good. But for those that don't know you, just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I mean you mentioned all the writing stuff, but most of my real life is that I'm the wife of a pastor in just a really small town in Middle Tennessee. And we live on 10 acres here and we garden and my kids are 10 and under. So it's a loud little house we have here. And yeah, we're having really good times just being part of the church and enjoying life. So,
We're in small town Kentucky, so
well,
I can
yeah,
relate
very
to
close
that.
by.
Yeah, not
We
far away.
drive up we drive up into Kentucky to the Mennonites up there to get our flour.
I love
Cross
that.
the border.
I love that. We just
Yeah.
drove through Tennessee as well, going to Hilton Head for a vacation,
Oh,
and
okay.
I love that area. I would live in Chattanooga if I
That's so
could.
funny. So we just went for an overnight in Chattanooga last night. Just got
Really?
back. Yep. And as we were driving away, I was like, honey, I don't want to ever leave where we live ever, but if you ever did and you want to plant a church in Chattanooga, I'm with you all the way.
It's
It's
great.
gorgeous. It's so gorgeous.
It's definitely underrated too. I think everybody in that's not in Tennessee, they go to Gatlinburg.
Right? Yeah.
And I'm like, no,
Nashville.
Chattanooga's where it's at. Yeah, well, Nashville's great, but in its own, it's like its own country.
It is.
But yeah,
I feel I
love
feel
that.
more and more a stranger to Nashville, honestly. And I grew up there,
Really?
but
Did you? Wow.
I did, yeah.
Wow. I mean, it is growing a lot. We are part of a church that is opening a campus in Franklin,
Okay.
because
Yeah.
of the amount of growth that's happening there. But okay, so kind of back to the question that I said, where does an idea for a book like this come? What prompted you
Yeah.
to write these
That's a good
letters?
question. Yeah, it's been a while, maybe 3 or 4 years, but it all started when I wrote some blog posts in this voice, just on my own little private blog that I have with my husband. And it was the very first letter, I think, was the one on when the patient believes that she's married down. And so it was a topic that was kind of like I wanted to get into it. I wanted to get into it with a really vivid kind of picture and illustration, but I could not see a way to write about it in just a straight nonfiction piece because it would have been, I mean, I could have interviewed somebody or it just would have been really tough to get a woman to talk about that level of interior life in a marriage. So the fiction kind of allowed me to write about something that I thought I was seeing among young wives and write about it in a vivid way, but without, I guess any awkwardness. So it was a really good device and I guess it also allowed you to root for good in a really unique way. And then I started addressing a few other things using that same voice. And I found it to be a really helpful way to think through certain things, to think about, well, what would Satan want to see happen in this area of my life? What would he want? So I just enjoyed it. But I probably only did 6 or 8 pieces on the blog and then kind of didn't use it again. And a few years later, my husband suggested that I pull it out and try to pitch it around a little bit as a book. So,
Go
yeah.
him. Well, let me give context because I forgot to do that for those that are listening. So your book,
Yeah.
My Dear Hemlock, is very important to have the context. So it's not atypical nonfiction. It is a spinoff, I would say, of C.S. Lewis's
Right.
Screwtape Letters.
Right. It's basically an imitation of the screw tape letters, but with a female patient living today and the voice of the demon writing instead of this kind of sardonic Oxford Don voice that Lewis was using with screw tape. It's this kind of catty female madam voice instead.
Hmm.
So,
You're
yeah.
so right in that. It would, I even thought about that. I was tidying up my house before we were talking, and I thought, you've almost found like a treasure trove of a medium because it allows you to address really hard and taboo
Right.
things,
That's right.
but
Yeah.
not be the one that's judging or saying what it is. You're just kind of like using the voice and conveying those ideas without it being like you are condemning a
That's
certain
right.
person.
That's right. And
Yeah.
also it means, as you're reading, and this is another useful thing about the fictionalizing of this stuff is just like all fiction, sometimes it kind of sneaks up on you from behind. So like you weren't necessarily thinking this is about me until suddenly it slaps you upside the head and it is about you. But if it's
Yeah.
not, in all the probably there's so many things addressed in the book that probably any one person reading wouldn't identify with every single letter. So the things that don't fit you, it's like, well, just pass right by those things, and when the shoe fits, wear it. But
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. There were multiple instances where I was slapped upside the head. I also don't cry in books. I'm not a crier. And I found myself crying towards the end. And mind you, I was inside of a chaotic, loud playground, indoor playground, where my kids were running wild, finishing it up. And the last chapter, I'm like, it caught me out of the blue when my eyes are welling with tears. And I was like, wow, it's moving in a way that I'm not normally moved by in books.
mm,
So I do think the fictional aspect was helpful because you start to really develop sort of like a fighting spirit for the patient. You're like,
right, right,
you're going to conquer this demon. Don't
that's
let him
right.
get you, kind of thing. So you say in the book blurb, and this caught my attention when the publicist had reached out to me. In the book blurb, it says, this book will give you the eyes to see the feminine vices that hide behind feminine virtues. Could you just kind of like flesh that out a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, for so many of the things that are sort of the ugliest parts of a woman's tendency, they're it's just the flip side of some very positive strength that a woman has, in a lot of cases. Like for instance, we're relationally oriented, so we're oriented to pick up on the relational things that are happening with other people. We're oriented to read kind of between the lines of people's emotions when we're with them, just to know how our kids are feeling, whether they're even able to describe it to us. So we're able to feel with people, we're very relational, but the way that can turn to sin would be things like manipulation, maybe, or an idolization of friendship, or having such a high expectation for our husband that we analyze everything he does and he always falls short of our expectations. And that would be like a kind of bending of the helpmeet role, that we, instead of watching him to help him, we watch him to criticize his mistakes, from the back seat. Or like with empathy, that empathy can be untethered to reality. Or the fact that we love physical spaces and are kind of made with a special gift to beautify and make lovely a physical space, and use a physical space to sort of bless the human beings that are in our lives. I think sometimes we confuse just nice things with effective ministry, like just having a bigger house or just having a nicer kitchen or whatever it is. Like with that's what a good life actually is the stuff. When that's not what a good life actually is. So yeah, I could think of more examples, I guess, but the things that make us glorious as women are some of the things that can be bent to the most horrific ends. You know.
Yeah. I really loved the it was actually kind of humorous, the chapters on empathy. when I got to the first chapter, which is essentially the idea of like was it borderless empathy?
Yeah.
Was
Boundless empathy. That
boundless.
was just me trying not to completely crib Joe Rigney's terminology in my
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
chapter.
Yes, yes.
I think he's
Uh,
usually saying untethered empathy or
okay,
whatever.
yes.
But yeah, boundless empathy, just empathy that is not doesn't know the borders of truth and what
Mm-hmm.
is actually true, and thinks that the most important thing is that you feel with and agree with the person that you're hearing from, because the suffering is real, but is doesn't think that it's important for both of you to remain connected to what's actually true in a given
Yes.
situation.
And I
So
was
yeah.
reading that and I thought, yeah, that's not me. I would I would describe myself as the person when I was reading the chapter, I thought, yeah, no, I'm typically the person that finds that
Bringing the
quality frustrating in
right,
women. And
right,
then I
yes,
got to the next chapter.
yes, right.
I was like, oh,
So then the flip side of that would be like I just Job's comforting. So the whole next chapter is about there are many people who are not, they don't have any issue with the empathy problems. Like they're not overly empathetic, and they're not, and they're well warned against it by the circles that they've been in, maybe if they've been listening to and reading stuff about that. But maybe for them instead, they are kind of the one size fits all ministering person who comes into a situation just assuming, before they've heard anything at all, assuming that the person who's suffering must be at fault in some way,
mm-hmm,
which
mm-hmm.
was the mistake that Job's friends were making when they were such totally useless, helpers and comforters to him, because they had this rubric in their mind, that if you sin, or if you suffer, you must have sinned in order to be receiving that suffering. So
Well, and
yeah,
I'm
it wouldn't.
100% guilty of that.
Right.
Which one would you say you resonate the most with?
Man, it just depends on the season. And I feel like, honestly, the more ministry that you do with people, sometimes I think the more you end up as the Job's comforter,
Mm,
because experience does tend to say most of the time there's sin lurking behind the suffering, and a lot of the time it's sin that the person is unaware of in their own life. And so you do tend to have this almost tendency to become jaded, in your ministry with people. But I also have found that I think you push through that and continue to minister, and you will be floored by some of the innocent suffering that you'll encounter. People who have
yeah.
the things that are happening to them are just happening. And what's scary about being able to acknowledge that is that it means you don't have an answer in that moment. I mean, you have an answer about God's goodness. You have a lot of answers, actually. But it feels like you don't have an answer when you can't say, okay, well, here's the sin for you to repent of here.
Yeah.
And it feels also scary to acknowledge that you yourself may one day encounter undeserved suffering.
Yeah.
That's the scary part.
Yeah. That is what it was almost as if you were in my head. It was that chapter was scary is a good word because I was reading the Job's Comforter chapter and I thought I have thought very similar things. And as you were concluding in the chapter, kind of saying that from the demon's perspective, just keep encouraging them in this mode, and eventually they'll realize they'll end up being the innocent sufferer. It'll happen to them, and that's when their eyes will sort of be opened. And it again, being hit beside the head, I thought, yeah, that is what I do, right? Like that's what I do as a Job's comforter per se is feel like I have an answer to the suffering and almost as if I have an answer to the suffering that it makes it okay or that I can circumvent it at some point in my own
Right.
life.
Right. You can
And
keep it
that's
at bay. Just don't do any of those wrong things, and then the
yeah.
suffering will never reach you.
Yes.
It's almost like a spiritualized version of the person who, every time they hear about someone having cancer, they have like a dietary response. Like they'll say, well, they ate a lot of meat, didn't they? Or something, I've known people who literally thought, well, if you eat a certain way, you will prevent disease. You will not get disease. And I'm like, okay, what about die? Are you going to die? Like, what?
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's just, I think it's sort of like the spiritual equivalent of that, where you're like, well, relational problems won't come if you obey the Lord, or spiritual depression won't come if you obey the Lord. And it's just not true, unfortunately.
Well, and I think we're seeing a lot of that to go down the wellness aspect. I think it's like this wellness salvation, and there's also the theme of like the anti-aging movement
Right.
where we think that if we do X, Y, and Z, we won't age, but we also will somehow not die. Like
Yeah.
that, and I actually think there's two, because I'll say I'm more of a natural or holistic person, but I've through the years had to come face to face with realizing that that is not my savior. And I know two major holistic health doctors who have both had stories where they're healthy as a horse and they're in a tragic accident. And, they're having to face sort of the reality of, okay, yes, I can do all of these things to make my body perfectly healthy and, rid it from disease, but I'm also not immune to just accident.
Accident. Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I loved that you kind of called that out. You called out a lot of things that are subtle or under the surface that you maybe don't think about. So one theme that I love that you talked about was confession. You had a whole chapter. I think did you have two
Yeah, there were
chapters on
two
confession?
chapters. I think just it was originally one big long chapter and we had to split up because it was too long.
Yes,
But yeah,
yes.
yeah, this was
Confession.
early.
What were the two chapters?
Yeah, so I can't honestly remember what was in each chapter, but just the content of that whole section. She's a newlywed, at the very beginning of the book, there's some stuff about just what the demons want to start, the habits they want to set in the newlywed couple, just habits of like rudeness, the kind of stuff that will turn into hatred later on, as it starts with just inattention and discourtesy. But then she gets into, you want to prevent confession of sin in her life, like just on every level. But it's going to look a little different depending on the kind of sin that you're dealing with. So, like, if she's a new Christian, she might have these big, deep, addictive types of sins in her life, the kind of big secret sins that feel impossible to conquer. Old things from her, from her single days. This is like your eating disorder, your porn, your
Hmm. Hmm.
drinking, that kind of stuff. And in that case, you want to delay or prevent confession by arguing that it's too big, like it's too much to confess, and get her to just delay it until she can kind of get her conscience to feel a little bit better. And then eventually, maybe she can just try to forget the incident and move on. And so her conscience will be slowly damaged over time by that process. But then there's the everyday sins against her fellow man, the kind of the rude word or the gossip or the things that she's going to be doing to some degree or other basically every day, and especially in the new marriage here. So here in that case, you delay her by getting her to think that it's too small really to confess, like this is not a big deal, we do this all the time, we
Yeah.
can't have a big conversation about it every time. And so you get her to build up crusted over small sins against, especially against her spouse, but anyone in her life over time, and it builds into this kind of tartar of the soul, but built up very slowly by not naming sin when you need to name something and confess it and forsake it.
Yeah.
So
That was
yeah.
just so good and very eye-opening. And I loved that I resonated with both of them. Uh, for the first one, there's a part of my story where when I was a young 16-year-old and struggling with porn, and
Mm.
I went to a youth group. I was going to youth group in a new area, and the youth pastor had happened to give a sermon on confession of sin and repentance. And he kind of had a call to action in at the end of his sermon to find somebody that you're close with, and if you have a sin that you need to confess it to them. And I pulled aside this girl that was on my soccer team who brought me to this service and confessed it. Never struggled with it again. It was like
Wow.
chains broke. And it's interesting because back then, as a 16-year-old, I didn't really think anything of it. I just remember being like, I just thought, okay, connection between confession of sin to
And
another
freedom.
person and freedom.
Mm.
And then as an adult, once you start to especially walk with the Lord longer and you're dealing with more subtle sins or more agreed socially acceptable sins, or smaller ones, if you want to put it that way,
Right.
I started to think to myself, okay, actually what happened back then was pretty miraculous. Like, people don't just
Right.
confess and break free from sin like that. That was definitely a move of God for my young, innocent mind to think that if I confess, the Lord's going to give me freedom here. And so, yeah, reading that chapter kind of brought back that memory. But then the second chapter on more small sins, I loved when you said, if you can name it as sin, the next time it happens, it's out there in
Everybody
the,
knows. Yeah. Everybody,
yes.
it makes, and this is something that I think I picked up in like nouthetic counseling circles, like biblical counseling circles. They talk about the I think it's the noetic effects of sin. I think I might be getting the word wrong there, but basically just that sin affects the mind. So it makes you stupider. Like sinning makes you less clear about what up is up and down is down, and you become more disoriented in sin. But confession of sin clarifies and makes you smarter. So it helps you to see the world more clearly, like the world that God actually made more clearly in yourself. And when someone sins against you, there can be a little bit of the same muddying for you, but also when someone confesses sin clearly to you, it clarifies. So it's clarifying to the person confessing and to the person confessed to, because then everybody can look at it and say, oh, yeah, we named that already. We called that sin. So the next time that comes up, and it probably will come up again, but we know what it is now. We know which bucket to put that in and what to do with it, and it makes you get clearer as time goes on. So obviously Satan does not want that for you.
Such a great renewed perspective on, because I never had heard that before until you brought it up in the book. That's really good. So you address a lot of temptations that are unique to women. That's sort of the goal with the book. Is the C.S. Lewis group tapes was more for a man. It was, the demon was addressing a man, and so what would it be if
Right.
he addressed a woman, and the
Right.
temptations that are
And
unique to women?
that's right. And the screw tape letters, is so applicable to pretty much anybody. I
It
think
is.
it's great for
It
young
is.
people. But the patient in that story, he wasn't married, so there's no marriage stuff in there, and obviously not a woman and not a mother and not a parent at all. So there's
Mhm.
just so much that I found like,
Sure.
oh, I can get into parenting, I can get into
Yeah,
all
yeah.
these things, and it was really nice. It was especially nice to do it slowly over time, so I didn't have to stay there in that voice for long periods of time at once.
Yeah,
But
yeah. What
yeah,
would you say, when you're writing this book, were you like, because as a writer myself, an aspiring author myself, when you work through a chapter or even like a premise or a thesis, you almost have to, like, it's like when a pastor jokes, like, if I'm going to be preaching on X sin on Sunday, the Lord's going to walk me through it that week leading up. Was
yeah,
there any like stories from writing where you were writing about something and then the Lord was like, you still have to work on this yourself?
yeah, definitely. I mean, most of it probably, or at least a good half. I mean, some of the topics and stories were really more from maybe a friend's life, but I would say I had the feeling throughout the writing process and even in the interviewing process over the past 6 months. I'll do an interview and talk about something, and then that night I'll be like, wow, like I was just talking about this, I was just
Mhm.
talking about this.
Yeah,
And the battle is always on, like it's always
yeah,
on. So
yeah, yeah.
yeah, and it's a scary thing to wade into, especially when you're explicitly calling out, Satan's devices. I guess you're like, well, what, where's he coming? I don't know. It definitely makes me more aware. It makes me more aware for sure.
It was,
So
I have to tell you too, I was cracking up. I got to find where it was. I don't even think I marked it. For those listening, I have a few pages marked that are quotes that I want to have her unpack. I literally laughed out loud. I loved when you opened a chapter. So this one says, "My dear Hemlock, I was on vacation last week inhabiting the front left wheel of a Walmart shopping cart." I laughed out loud, and then you did it again with, I can't remember what it was, and I was like, That's where I would expect Satan or like a demon to be, right? It's on a wobbly left
Right.
wheel of a shopping cart.
Yeah, I have no idea if that's true. That was just purely me having fun, but
Having fun.
I think there was a demon in my shopping cart at Walmart this morning, actually.
It was good for
They're
me this
just
early.
terrible.
They are
Yeah.
terrible. Okay, so some of the temptations like envy, empathy, the desire to be famous, you talked about
Mm.
like diversified pleasures. Why do you think these particular struggles are so prevalent like for women and how can women, through your book begin to recognize and address them?
Yeah, so yeah, there's so many different ones
A
you just
loaded question.
mentioned. Yeah, you
Yeah.
just mentioned several ones that are different, but
Maybe stick with one.
yeah, the diversified pleasures is one that that was a new concept to kind of think through, and I can't remember where that came up, but it just I think it was just from watching my own heart and just seeing how often I want so many things. Like I just want so many different things, so many different kinds of things, and sometimes things that are not even logically compatible with each other. Like you can't have this wonderful life at home with your kids day in and day out where you're teaching them and also many, many hours a day to write in. You can't have both those
Mm,
things. They're not actually logically possible. You have to choose, and you have to choose by faith, based on what you think your duties are in this season of life. You can't have a husband who's logical and extremely bookish and devotes many hours of every day to study, and also this super relaxed, outgoing, like outdoorsy dude that you've made up in your mind. Those things really aren't the same. That's not the same kind of person even. So for some reason, we really believe that we should have this life and this life. We should have this husband and a totally different kind of husband, or we should have. There's so many things that we're picking up from all around, and we believe for some reason that it's possible to have all this stuff.
yeah.
And maybe part of it is social media era, where we're watching a lie all day, every day. I think a lot of us would do a lot better if we would be off of it.
Yeah.
But I think that that goes also to just on the purely spiritual level. What we want is happiness and joy, and we also want total autonomy and not to submit to our Lord. And those are two incompatible desires. They aren't the same thing, and they're mutually exclusive. So,
It's the battle of the flesh.
right.
Um,
But
and I love too. Oh, go ahead.
just laying things down next to each other and saying like, are these things even logically possible? The things that I'm wanting, and being a little more, just a little more logical with ourselves, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. You kind of touched on the social media aspect, but could you kind of discuss how this book,
Treats it.
addresses? Yeah.
Yeah, so the chapter about social media in the book is called On the Pocket Mirrors. So this, I think I cribbed this idea from Tony Reinke's book about social or about the phones. I think he talks about them being mirrors of the soul, sort of. But so the demon says these are pocket mirrors. The human beings carry them around everywhere. They're not like if they were to walk around with actual mirrors that they were gazing into all the time, they wouldn't do that. They'd be embarrassed to be seen doing that. But instead, they are looking into these mirrors that show them all day, every day, what they love, what other people are saying about them, what makes them feel interesting or taste, makes them feel like they have taste or that they're important or relevant people. And the victory that we've seen, the demon is saying, the victory that we've seen in these pocket mirrors is that the human beings are basically removed completely from the flow of time while they're on these devices. So God, the enemy, has made them as human beings to walk down the road of time one step after another. They're humans, they're creatures. They were made to experience each moment. Sometimes the moments feel slow when it's a hard time. Sometimes they feel fast when it's a good time. But they were meant to experience time. And the pocket mirrors literally just lift their feet off the road of time and float them down to another point and drop them back down. And they're as they do this, they're atrophying, like their muscles, their ability to even experience time is going away,
Mm.
where they can't even sit and have dinner with their friends without feeling this itching kind of need to get out of time again and float down the road. So they're pulling their phones out, and it's not even work they're avoiding, it's pleasure. So basically she's saying like this works basically as well as a good old-fashioned drug addiction, in terms of just disembodying them and removing them from the flow of time. And the demon is also saying it's pretty similar to what we've done. We've rejected the enemy's time. We are also a little bit disoriented in time in the rebellion. And that's just me, honestly, on kind of it was just an idea I was exploring, really, that because I've always wondered, how does a demon stay in a battle that they know they can't win? And then I've also experienced addictions, and I know how disorienting they can be, where you like, I don't want to be right now. I want to be somewhere else or some other time, but I don't even know where I want to go to. And when you're waiting for your next hit of whatever the thing is that you're addicted to, you you're just very disoriented. So
Yeah.
I figure that rebellion is disorienting like that.
Well, and I loved the juxtaposition when you talked about the gardening, uh,
Right. Yes.
and just like the contrast of that, or the positive would be that the patient is in a garden and she's pulling weeds and 30 minutes passes, but she's completely experienced that full 30 minutes. She wasn't
Yes.
escaped from it.
Right.
And
She does have that feeling of like, oh, what, 30 minutes already? But it's because it was pleasant work that she was involved in, and she was fully there for every minute. Yeah. Yeah.
oh, uh it made me want to. I have my sourdough starter in the fridge, and it made me want to get it out and just like
Yeah.
bake again.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
What would you say is like, or was the most challenging part? And I was reading it throughout, and I just thought, man, this would have been tough to come at the from the perspective of a demon. Like, did you find any sort of like spiritual warfare while writing this?
Well, it was kind of what I was describing earlier, where I would feel like, man, all of a sudden, I'm working on this section. All of a sudden, this thing that wasn't a problem is feeling like a problem again, or something like that. So, for sure, and I just maybe just with more awareness of it. But as far as just the difficulty, I found it really tough. And I got this note many, many, many times from the editor, where I would slip into kind of talking more just like a Christian about the stuff. So like using more Christian-y terminology, or
Yeah.
yeah, or just making like normal Christian commentary. It's very hard to write about these things and not really be able to use scripture at all. Like it's very
Mm.
it's kind of stymieing, to be like, well, I can't just do what I would normally do, which is to pull verses right here. So yeah,
Hmm.
that was easy.
Well, I want to go through some of the quotes that I pulled, and I had to dwindle some of them down and just kind of, I'm going to read them, and then I would love for you to just kind of like unpack them a little bit further. This one is the one on prayer, which I really, really loved this chapter. But the quote says, prayer is the commander in chief's personal telephone number, a handwritten invitation to sit in his chamber for a meal and a chat. The book makes believers. Prayer seems to make radicals. It produces people who don't just claim but actually appear to believe that they are in war. Book reading can be dangerous, but prayer is the beginning of the end of your work with this girl.
Yes. So this was sort of a treatment. And the book that she's referring to in there, that she won't bring herself to use the word Bible, but she's talking about the Bible. And basically, this was me just, I'm in sort of reformed
Mm-hmm.
type world,
Mm-hmm.
and I have been most of my life, and
Yeah.
the little, Reformed Baptist church out here. And it's a very bookish world to be in. It just is. And we value the Bible, I think, in a wonderful way. We value study, and yet, if we have a ditch, and I think sometimes we do have a ditch, I think it is in an awareness of the spiritual,
Spirit. Yeah.
yeah, of the spirit, just of the working of the spirit, and of the power of prayer, like expecting prayer to be a real, efficacious thing to be doing. So my experience, I also, in this little church that that we've been in since we've been married. I came out here as a single person and joined the church, and there's a Wednesday night prayer meeting that's been going on for 40 plus years, and the women and men get together and give requests and then split by gender and give more requests and then split into groups of 3 or 4 and pray. And this is how I learned to pray as a young Christian. I was praying with older women who had been praying for years, and it's scary to do when you don't want to go. Like, you don't want to go to prayer meeting when you're a new Christian. You're scared to go. But it's the way you learn is by praying with other believers, and then praying alone and
Yeah.
learning. You can only do
Oh,
it.
and it's almost like learn by fire a little bit. Like,
Right. You have to do it in order to learn
mhm.
it. There's no
We
other
kind of
way.
touched on that. Like, if you can just delay her for whatever reason, whether it be she's not doing it right, distraction, that's
Yeah.
just your goal.
Yeah, or
However,
make her believe that, like, she's waiting for these very passionate, emotionally fulfilling prayers to kind of overtake her. And so the idea of, like, saying her prayers, even using written prayers to pray by for a while, that all of that is very, just doesn't feel right to her. It would feel perfectly fine to her grandmother or her great grandmother. Like, they would totally understand that sometimes you just say your prayers, and
yeah.
that's what you do.
And it's not this emotional experience that I also love to touch on when you say that you kind of are in a reformed church. I really love, again, going back to the ability to use this as a medium to convey or to talk about more taboo topics. But I love that you talked on kind of find out in the patient which way she leans. Does she lean
Yes.
more, whether it reformed, Bible based, or does she lean maybe more charismatic or spirit focused? And then kind of you talked
Push
about
towards the ditch. Yeah.
yes, and I
Yeah.
was like, man, that's great because I think that we're seeing that happen, right? And I have seen, people get really caught up in all of that, and it's like the Spirit wouldn't want that. The Lord wouldn't want that sort of division. But that's what Satan's going to do.
Right.
Um,
And almost any of the
okay.
topics we've talked about probably have ditches on either side of them. Like the empathy, Job's comforting thing. Like, those are just two ditches basically that you're finding which way to push, and the demon
Yep.
wants to push you
Yep.
where you already lean.
There's a book called Whole. Oh, I can't remember who wrote it, but she uses the phrase like embrace the tension a lot.
Oh, okay.
And just that you could go one way or the other, whether it be in heart or in head, whether it's in sinner or saint, whether it's spirit or truth. But what does it look like to sort of embrace both of those? Because we were meant to be sort of like whole, and we're not all sinner or all saint. We can't be all Bible and no spirit kind of thing.
Yeah.
It
And
was a good one.
probably our tendency is like whatever's more comfortable that we already seem to sort of automatically understand. It would be nice to just stay there and not ever have to grow,
Right. Right.
in a new
Yep.
direction. Yeah.
Okay, next quote is from On Diversifying Pleasures. You said, even her highest affections are not so high. She loves not holiness itself, but the idea of holiness. She loves the idea of becoming more respectable, more knowledgeable, more fruitful, more righteous. It's a love of progress, of dignity, of potential, of growth. She still rarely fixes her thoughts on him. At her best, she is engrossed with the idea of herself being more engrossed with him. Dagger to the heart,
Mm-hmm.
Tilly. That was yeah. I've felt convicted of that very thing. Almost like an idolization of growth, and that growth in Christ, spiritual growth slash my pursuit of the Lord is almost like the end rather than the means to an end.
Right. Yeah. Like, so what exactly are we, what is the growth leading us to? Who are we getting closer to?
Hmm.
Who are we looking at and fixing our minds on? Uh, and how are we going to grow or develop or whatever this progress is that we love so much? How is that, any of that going to happen? If we're not gazing on him, then we won't be made over into his image. That's the way that happens. So,
Right.
yeah.
I loved how in every chapter you kind of dismantle the sort of hidden, the vices, if you will, and sort of illuminate what's really going on underneath. And it's really helpful because you're putting language to something that we as women struggle with, but we don't often know how to explain it. And so even just that quote, it's helpful in a moment when I'm realizing, okay, Justine, are you truly, pursuing holiness in order to look like Christ? Or are you just wanting to look like you are holy?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was helpful. Let's see. I marked Job's comforting, but we already talked about that. And I did want to read the final, like, one from the final chapter. Spoil alert for those who haven't read Screw Tape Letters, but the patient does pass in the
Yes,
end.
she dies.
Yep, she dies. So, but it was on. I'm so glad that you did that because it was just like a complete picture. So let me read from this. It says, and she, in one moment, the beeping monitors, the sour smell of morphine, the surreal view of her papery white hands on the familiar coverlet that she sewed with the same hands 30 years ago, the tender whispers of an older daughter comforting a younger daughter in the room, the slow loss of consciousness, all of it gave away in an instant. Like a shroud, like a hospital gown, like a weight off dropped the life that was passing away, and suddenly her naked soul was being clothed anew. She heard the warm welcome and song from enemy workers. I heard you even suffered a glimpse of your old friend from before the revolution. Harsh are the wages of failure indeed. She saw the faces of her mother, her childhood neighbor, her husband's grandfather. And I just loved the way that you sort of gave this visual for that moment when somebody is ushered into heaven. And that was the moment that made me tear up because it was very sobering to read because it's real,
Yeah, right.
And if you've experienced loss, you've experienced that.
And that's where we're all walking, we're all walking towards that moment. And we don't know how many turns and how many years of road we've got. We just know there's going to be that moment for each of us. In the last, 5 or 10 years, we've lost several really dear saints who were women in our church community. And I think I interviewed a family member to get some of those just details on that. But for me, just the impact every time there's a long-term faithful pillar woman in our community. First of all, when she's gone, the whole community is changed by her not being part of it. The work that she was doing, the voice that she was, all of those things are losses. But watching someone die, I think I always picture like you're in a room and there's a curtain there and they have pushed the curtain aside to walk through it. And for one moment you get a glimpse of what's behind the curtain because they were just pushing through it. And there's just something about it's just, it's precious in the Lord's sight, the death of his saints.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Oh man. Oh, just so good. So what is your greatest hope for women to take away from when they read this book?
yeah, I want women to see the battle that we're in and to see how much power we have, how we can be a real threat to the armies, of the enemy. Like our lives they can be a real threat or they can be completely innocuous, to the enemy. If we choose to pursue only those things that we automatically want to pursue that feel good to us to be pursuing, then we can be perfectly harmless to them. But a woman who fears the Lord, she's terrible as an army with banners. She's powerful in a uniquely feminine way, which is a flexible, life-giving, glorifying way. It's a uniquely feminine power that every woman has.
Oh, that was so good. There's really not much more to add there. This was such a refreshing conversation, and I really pray that it blesses whoever listened. And you're on social media, but you're not
I'm not
act.
putting things on Instagram really, but
I respect that.
yeah, I just had to get it out.
Um, yeah, I
You
feel
can find
that.
me on Facebook. I'll check up on people on Facebook. So
Okay. Well, the book you can get it Amazon, really
Yeah.
anywhere you get books, I'll make sure to link it.
Yeah.
Highly recommend it.
There's an
Highly recommend.
audiobook. Yeah. I read the audiobook this time. That was fun. It was my first time to read one of my own books. So that was good.
Cool. Okay, great. I'll make sure to include all of that in the show notes. Well, Tilly, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.